A Galene Woman knows what's up with her period. Hi, I'm Cole, and this is the A Galene Woman Is podcast, your weekly deep dive into all things self-care and women's wellness. Today, we're getting up close and personal. Everyone who has or had a uterus will know this on an intimate level, but it's the topic everyone also wants to skirt around, will say it's gross to talk about, and thinks it's just a private matter. The mystery really is real, but when at least half our population has a period, why are we so obsessed with stressing the importance of not talking about them? But of course, before we start, and while you're listening, take this time to do something for you. Go sit somewhere comfy, put a cozy jumper on, maybe even do your nails for a little added self-care. Whatever you can manage right now, just sit and relax. Do it entirely for yourself, so you have proof you cared for yourself today. It would be right to say that the normalization of discussions around periods has certainly come a long way, but the fact that Courtney Cox was the first person to say period in an ad, and that was only back in, 1985, we can definitely assume this still makes so many people uncomfortable to talk about. It's kind of crazy to think about how much damage comes off the back of demonizing periods. How much fear is put into everyone with a uterus to conceal, hide, and stress a thing that affects them every single month. It's a little silly, really, when someone mentions a period and another person's response is, ugh, I don't want to hear about that. Well, tough. All of us over here with a period are actually so bored of this scaredy cat attitude towards our bodies. Some of you may be wondering what this topic has to do with your self-care journey. But for many of us with uteruses, much like our relationship with self-care, understanding, embracing, and nurturing our connection to how reproductive health works, especially at that time of the month, can so often be an afterthought. The fact that the pill is so commonly given out for any issue ever to happen to someone with a period absolutely demonstrates that we're a little in the dark as to what menstruation is and the way its care is essential to our health. Periods are natural, perfectly normal, and have never ever been gross. It's a hard social stigma to break. Now, for a little preface for this episode, as I know some of you will be thinking, Cole, you're not a doctor, how can you talk about a medical subject? And I am totally conscious of this fact. I have spent a lot of time doing research, not only for myself, but also for Galene's blog, which has an entire section dedicated to female sexual and reproductive health. I don't always get it right, and absolutely feel free to call me out on it. But if there is anything my degree has actually helped me with, it's the ability to find legitimate research. So I'm super detailed about checking my resources and their references too, and where my information comes from. From one person who menstruates to another, I really know how important it is for us all to get and know this stuff correctly. So I want to get it right for both the Galene community and also myself. There's no point in using inaccurate, wild facts on this kind of subject. It's not going to do anything to help us. So let's take a little faith. And also, if you're that kind of person, check my bibliography, because I've included everything I've used in this podcast to fact check. Now let's get back to it. Understanding and managing your reproductive health, and therefore having a really good knowledge of your period, is genuinely a crucial aspect of both your wellness and your self-care. It's not only vital for parts of your life involving family planning and prevention of disease, but it's also knowledge of your hormonal health, and there's numerous lesser acknowledged benefits. A big one, I think, that massively gets overlooked in knowing just the basics of your personal menstrual cycle is it gives you such a peace of mind that your body is healthy. It can help you make actually effective steps in your lifestyle to understand the impact of your diet and how that's affecting your menstrual cycle or your exercise or just stress points, and how to massively subdue their impact just because you know how they're tied in with your period. You can rest easy knowing you've done your best to keep a balance. Having that peace of mind naturally aids all of your efforts to just work towards self-care and a self-care motivated lifestyle. It's empowering to actually feel like you're making informed decisions regarding your body on both your sexual and reproductive health, and you aren't entirely reliant on guesses to know when something's up or that you just need a change. Therefore, it's super easy to argue that something that really does impact our everyday lives, from decisions around contraception to treatments to sexual activities, can be done with our physical, emotional, and mental well-being in mind. But of course, doing all of this, even in the 21st century, comes with its taboos. Social stigma for all those with periods, as I've said, can really be crushing. Whether it's religious or cultural beliefs that affect us, or the fact that social norms dictate it's socially unacceptable to discuss your menstruation, the list kind of feels endless as to why it's just easier not to learn and not spread the important information. I really do understand this concept of it being a private concern, as it is obviously a pretty intimate experience to be bleeding in such a way. The nature of sexual and reproductive health can really make people reluctant to discuss it. But the problem is that this also negates the idea of seeking help for these issues. It leads everyone who's ever been told, I think it's crude to talk about your period, to assume there is something wrong in raising a question about your menstrual cycle. That's where the damage really lies. It not only delays the medical help that a person could really need, but it also allows the spread of some serious myths and misinformation about your reproductive and sexual health, which naturally are supported by unreliable sources, basically making a complete cycle of fear, shame, and judgment, of which I am very much not a fan. The obvious stigma, of course, relates back to the historical systems of misogyny and patriarchy that controlled women's bodies and reproductive rights. I love how I've just said that that's historical, as if that doesn't still happen and is happening right now. But knowledge is power in this, and I genuinely think education on sexual and reproductive health is the biggest and also kind of the easiest way to break down so many of the reasons people give for being anti-abortion or funny about talking about periods. Education empowers us, and that is for everyone, not just those with periods, but everyone, with accurate information. It normalizes open discussions and reduces fear and shame around talking about periods. There are so many healthcare professionals, educators, and community leaders who are already leading the way by providing factual information and advocating for comprehensive education on these topics. The benefit of social media now is that they can use these to help this process too. We can adopt a culture of openness and respect for every single person around this issue, and we can better support each other because of it. People will feel like they can seek care when they need it and make genuinely informed decisions that ultimately dismantle the social stigma around female sexual and reproductive health. Okay, so in this episode, we're going to look at those common questions around periods, the menstruation phase, from colour to lateness to what you should be using, what you shouldn't be using. And I have really scoured the internet and all the science journals I could find on each of these questions to give you a feel for the solutions for each of those questions. So let's get into them. First up, why is my period late? There are lots and lots of reasons as to why your period could be late. Obviously, the big elephant in the room is pregnancy, but if you're not in a relationship or just know for sure that there's absolutely no way that that could be the reason why, then it would be great to have an inkling as to what's happening. The first reason, especially if you're having a hard time right now, is stress. Whether it's personal or work-related, having an increased level of stress or cortisol specifically could absolutely throw off your period's arrival time. Scientifically, this is called, hypothalamic amenorrhea. Amenorrhea. Bit of a mouthful, but it basically means that the part of your brain that controls reproduction might not produce the hormone that it normally would, delaying menstruation because basically you're super stressed and clearly your brain doesn't think it's the right time to make the situation a bit worse. But remembering that it's your cortisol levels that are most likely impacting this is the important thing to remember. Reason 2 is remembering that the human body is all connected, so if you're feeling ill or if you're sick, that will also affect your cycle. In these moments, your body is obviously wanting to focus on getting you better, so sometimes your period just needs to wait a second. Reason 3 is if you're experiencing any sort of weight change, this is a really big one actually, your period's timings will absolutely be affected by this. Going back to the idea of like hormonal triggers, when you're having major shifts in your weight, sometimes your body just can't keep up. So for instance, if you lose a lot of weight really, really, really fast, then your body can't actually make enough estrogen, which will obviously affect when your period comes, because that's obviously one of the key players. So definitely consider whether or not the weight change you're going for is having a positive effect on your period. Reason 4 is perhaps a little bit more circumstantial, but I was actually really interested by this. So if you're someone that often travels between time zones, i.e. you basically are a regular sufferer of jet lag, or you're someone who has recently changed to a night shift work pattern, this could create a bit of a wonky period cycle for a while. It's only temporary because obviously your body's adjusting to the different sleep patterns. But if you're a little confused as to why the delay has come out of nowhere, but you've just come back from a very long holiday from the other side of the world, there's most likely your answer. Reason 5 is the obvious one, which I'm sure you're aware of, but it's definitely worth remembering, and that's birth control. Whether you're using an IUD, the pill, literally any type of I'm going to call it internal contraception, in that you have to take it or that it's put inside of you. The hormonal changes will definitely change your timings, but it also goes for if you're switching birth control or you're coming off of it for a period of time, your body is absolutely going to need a period of time to adjust, and that's okay. That's totally normal. I would definitely talk to your doctor about what is expected for you specifically in those periods. Very obvious, birth control is affecting why your period might be late, but don't dismiss it because it's often the one that can also get very quickly forgotten. If none of those reasons seem applicable, then maybe you've, miraculously conceived. But seriously, if you are worried, there is no harm in checking with your GP, your sexual health nurse. They are always available and active. And if you think there might be a slight possibility, just take the test. It doesn't hurt. It's not the end of the world. Just give it a go if you really need to. All right. The next question is also a pretty big one, but it's that question that never really gets explained in sex ed, which really confuses me, but hey, that's why I'm here. Despite it being, it's also quite an essential understanding point of your period, and that is, why is my period blood changing colour? Again, like the period being late thing, there are a lot of reasons and factors at play for the different colours you will see across your period cycle. Mostly it's hormones, the regularity or irregularity of your actual period, something like a vaginal or uterine infection. We're going to briefly go over them all. First colour on the list that I've written down is a very bright red, and I think most people would know that this is the start of your menstruation. The colour of your period blood will, in the majority of the cases, be this very vivid red colour. It's mainly because it's the heaviest part of your period and it's all coming out pretty continually at this point. There's no real stop and start. It's just go, go, go. But it's also not had chance to oxygenate yet because it's only just started to shed from your uterus lining. So, of course, this means that the longer your period flows and therefore slows down, the darker the colour gets. But it's also why it starts off this very vivid red. The second colour is pink. This is also a signal of the beginning of your period. I always like to think of it as almost like a little flag saying, hi, I'm here, because pink blood is basically just a mix of the start of your menstrual flow and other cervical fluids that are clearly reducing the red colour. It's worth noting, pink can also be a sign of low estrogen levels, most likely due to hormonal birth control, but not always. So if it does continue, or if it does seem to occur further into your period, like it lasts for kind of a while, it may be worth visiting the doctor and discussing this. The third colour, it's kind of two colours, but they're very much related to each other, so we're just going to lump them into one, is dark red and brown. And this is kind of coming to the middle, to the end of your period, and coming back to that idea of like oxygenating that I was talking about earlier. So dark red, sometimes it can even look black, which is kind of scary, but hey, literally means the blood has just been in your uterus or vaginal canal for a little bit longer. It's kind of thickening because it's been exposed to more oxygen. It's totally normal, no worries necessary. And brown is basically just a progression of this. So Of course, it kind of indicates that you're coming to the end of your period if the period blood is looking brown, and it also might be a bit thicker. This is the point where I think a lot of people transfer over to pads because they're just a little bit comfier, because brown period blood just does not seem to vibe with tampons. Maybe that's just me. Somebody else confirm that this is not just me rambling on. The fourth color is actually something that I didn't know and was really curious to learn about, which is orange. Again, it's near the end of your period and perhaps not a colour that you would naturally expect to be mentioned, as I've just said, but genuinely you may see orange period blood from time to time. It's the same reasons as dark red blood, but it just has led to a burnt orange colour rather than reddish. In some cases, orange menstrual blood does signify pregnancy, especially if it's kind of light. So if you're already feeling a little funky, it might be worth a check. The fifth colour, and the rarest one, absolutely, is purple. So if you ever see purple, just trust me where I'm going with this. Purple period blood, this is typically a good indication that your body is making too much estrogen. So there's a lot of things you can do for this, and we're not going to discuss them today because we could be here for hours. But if it does happen on every period, or you're experiencing irritation or discomfort while having purple period blood, and this is not obviously normal for you, please contact your doctor. I will leave some resources in the comments for this situation. Next question. So, this is definitely a common worry. Why does my period smell? Naturally, your period gives off a scent. I feel like it's one of those that you can kind of smell the entirety of your period, like you would know exactly. We all know that exact smell that I'm talking about. And for some people, it's genuinely awful. Some people really, really hate it. But this isn't necessarily something you should be worried about. You know, there are a few reasons as to what the hell is going on. Some people, this was kind of wild. Some people genuinely believe that periods smell like death. I've never had this experience personally, but apologies to you if this is something you've suffered with. And honestly, this is not actually a big deal because it's most likely a result of the blood and the tissues that are leaving your body, coupled with the natural bacteria that are in and around your vagina. So the really bad smell can happen just from the natural process of having a period. It can also happen, and especially if it smells really, really bad, if you've left your tampon in too long, which is more common probably near the end of people's periods because, you know, you're bleeding less, you're kind of thinking about it less as well, and it's kind of having a lesser impact on your daily activities. But just give yourself a little check a little bit more often than you think you probably should if you're a little unsure as to why everything's smelling a bit funky. But yeah, just generally think about how long you're leaving your tampons in if smell is something you're worried about. A big statement, and definitely I think one of those common tropes that come around periods and just vaginas in general, is that something smells fishy. This is definitely signs of a medical issues, absolutely no question about it. So just call the doc if you notice this. Usually it's a sign of BV or bacterial vaginosis, which is just an infection. And it's also quite common when you're menstruating, though they're not linked. Most of the time when you realize you have BV, you're on your period. So it's totally natural, it happens, and it can actually be solved pretty easily with the right diagnosis. There are some absolutely brilliant brands and companies out there with really super helpful products for this kind of issue. So again, I will put those in the comments. Generally, odor changes are, in the majority of cases, just a sign of not practicing good hygiene while you're on your period. So just give yourself that little bit of TLC when you're bleeding, because it really will make the world of a difference. And it can kind of feel tricky, especially with all the blood, and it feels a bit messy. But when you're in the shower, just really make sure you're looking after yourself. Down there's a really good article on the Galene Company website about keeping your vaginal health in check. So definitely check that out if you are looking for some guidance as how to do it. But yeah, following on from this, as it's also something that can come up with smell, what actually is discharge? Now, I've included this, even though we're kind of focusing in on the menstrual phase. Understanding your discharge is a very, very good way of also understanding your period. So I've included this section just on that front. But it's pretty simple, really. Discharge is just cervical mucus, vaginal secretions, bacteria, all helping you keep your vaginal canal lubricated. So there is actually nothing wrong with discharge. It's something we all have. It has its own pH levels, and it's why it impacts your underwear and all this kind of stuff. It's so normal and should not be worried about unless there are some serious issues, and I'll get to those in a minute. The colour, the consistency, the amount all depend as to where you're at in your cycle. Since we're specifically talking about the menstrual phase, I'm going to hone in on what it's like just before your period. So during the luteal phase, which is just before you bleed, your discharge will be quite thick and will become a very opaque white colour more than any other point. And if you really do pay attention to it, it really does change. So knowing this will probably actually help you be able to tell with even more accuracy when your period is due. If your discharge is making you itch, or it's burning, or it's unusual, or it comes with that fishy smell, you probably do have an infection. So to end this, like all the other questions that I have answered thus far, if this is the case, you definitely should see a doctor. I think something that scares us all, but normally actually isn't an issue, and it kind of leads into the next question, is blood clots. Are they normal during your period? How do they occur? What is going on? It's always been something that's been a bit mysterious because it's definitely not something that's discussed in sex ed, but as I said earlier, that's why we're here. They normally happen during the heaviest days of your period. So for me, that's 2 and 3, sometimes 1, mainly because they happen when the uterine lining sheds in larger amounts of blood and the blood pools. It can coagulate, which is such a weird word. And it basically looks like it would if you got a scrape on your knee or something and it starts to scab. That process is what's happening to your period blood. It is totally normal. There are a few situations where you should be worried, of course, there always is. When should you be worried? These are the few instances where you definitely should check. So if you're passing any clots that are larger than a penny, then call the doc. Your clots are very frequent or coincide with an abnormally heavy flow, leading to you having to change your tampon more, and that's not normal for you. Or if clots are happening with significant pain. Any of these and medical help is absolutely necessary. When you're having a heavy flow and the clots do seem a little big, it can also make sleeping and the night time really quite difficult. So in this situation, I was just going to add on to this, opting for a super absorbent pad or tampon, which was also designed for longer wear, can make this whole process so much nicer. You can also pair it with period pants if you want the extra protection. All of it just helps with the ease of mind when you're going to bed. So to move on to the next question, and looking a little closer at heavy periods, because I know that this is something many of us have suffered with, whether it's just a couple of one-offs or if it's something that we do have consistency. Heavy menstrual bleeding is not a usual experience, or at least they shouldn't be. Sometimes people think HMB or heavy menstrual bleeding is normal because they've always had it or because people in their family have had a long history with them, but it can really lead you to be susceptible to not only other conditions but also be signs of other conditions in itself. You may be experiencing HMB if you're experiencing some of the following. I will give a more exhaustive list in the comments because there's quite a few different indicators, but I've got a few here just now. So you need to change your tampon or pad after less than 2 hours. You need to double up by wearing 1 or 2 pads and a tampon because it's too heavy. Your menstrual flow has blood clots over the size of a pound or larger. You have a menstrual flow so heavy that it keeps you from doing things that you would normally do, such as going to work or school or social activities, etc. This is really important. If your period is making you incapable of doing normal life, it's not okay. That's common, but not normal. 2 more things. You have periods that are longer than 8 days. That's absolutely a sign of heavy menstrual bleeding. And you're also tired, lacking energy, or are short of breath. So there's a few things. This is one of those things that could really be an indicator of other reproductive problems. So seeking medical attention and being persistent about the issue, because I know, unfortunately, this kind of thing is so commonly overlooked. It can really hopefully lead to a quicker resolution. This is a bit different to the reasons for bleeding between your periods, which is the next question. It's always a bit of a surprise when you've gone to the bathroom and there's blood when there definitely shouldn't be. Even more so if you've never experienced it. Again, there's a lot of things that can be the source of why you're spotting, which is what bleeding in between your periods is called. Anything from fibroids to STIs. Literally, the list is very, very long, which is why it's always worth checking with a doctor. But something else, which it is likely to be, if the other 2 things I've just said seem out of scope for you, is genuinely just ovulation. So I was reading an article, and according to Dr. Alison Rogers, who is a reproductive endocrinologist, obstetrician, and gynecologist at the Fertility Centers of Illinois, suggests about 5% of people with periods experience bleeding around their ovulation, and that's consistently. So obviously it's possible that what's happening to you is just a little during ovulation bleeding. I've bled a couple times between my periods before, or spotted, and it properly freaked me out. But actually, when I checked my period tracking app, I was exactly on the day that it said I was supposed to be ovulating. So I found my answer pretty quickly. I calmed down a little bit. It's not always a sign of something negative. Sometimes you can feel a little bit of pain with it too. I definitely did. And it's known quite expectedly as ovulation pain. I can feel a mild tweak or a little bit of a funky cramp, and it can last for a few minutes to a whole day. You know your body, so hopefully it will be clear as to whether something's off, but this is definitely a normal thing to happen. So, final question. We made it. What are all the period product options I should consider, or do I need period pants? I feel like this is one that's come out of a lot of us being keenly aware of how unsustainable tampons and pads can be. But we're not really sure what on earth else we can try, or whether or not we should commit, just in case we don't find it comfy or we don't like it. Or basically a whole host of reasons given as to why we might not like non-traditional options for period products. So aside from pads and tampons, which both have more sustainable options nowadays, so like reusable tampon applicators or just reusable pads, the big ones that you are definitely thinking of when I talk about this kind of thing is menstrual cups / discs and period pants. I actually haven't tried a menstrual cup or disc, mainly because it took me a hot minute to get comfortable with tampons after some slightly traumatic situations. So it's definitely not been one I've given a go yet, but I have quite a few friends who absolutely swear by them. And to be honest, I'm seriously considering it. Not only are they sustainable, but you can actually keep them in for quite a while, depending on the size. And obviously that's dependent on you. And the brand you buy is also linked to that, but it's super easy to keep them clean. Now, if you put it in incorrectly or you're using the wrong size, then it could be uncomfortable. This is noted by every menstrual cup brand out there. And it's good to consider your flow in terms of what kind of menstrual cup you're going to want to go for, or if you want to go for a menstrual disc. But honestly, once you've made the right choice, they sound like they couldn't be easier. They're a really good option for those who just want an absolute faff-free period, because you really just don't have to think about it that much. And yeah, who wouldn't want that? Okay, the next is period pants, and there's been a lot of news recently about these, mainly after a bunch of brands were called out for putting unusually large amounts of silver in the product or in the period underwear, which does hold health risks. That has been acknowledged. Ultimately, the silver is used as an antimicrobial for smell and hygiene. That's why it's there. And it is used, I believe, in the companies that they've found. I think M&S is one of them. And they have found that like the reason they put them in there was because by EU and UK standards that it was totally okay. But obviously that doesn't necessarily mean it is actually okay. So if you're a little nervous, there are still plenty of brands, and I'll again list them in the comments, that don't use silver, and they are in the majority of cases really, really safe. Like it's just these few instances where we've had the slight worry about period pants. So don't panic. Don't throw out your period pants yet. And they're also incredibly convenient. I cannot stress this enough. If you're ever feeling lazy and are really not bothered by the idea of free bleeding, they are an absolute life changer. And even if you're still skeptical, consider it this way. Let me paint you a little picture. I always hate sleeping with a pad. Like I am not comfy using a tampon overnight, so pads are my only option. But pads rub on your skin, ultimately they make you feel so messy and kind of gross because everything gets everywhere and it gets on your pajamas, and they're not great. They move when you sleep. It's not a vibe. There are a million reasons, as you could tell, why I am not a fan of pads while I sleep, but period pants absolutely solve this issue and make sleeping on your period actually a comfortable experience. With all of this, choosing your period products is obviously a very personal decision, and although there are a lot out there, it's okay if you're not comfortable with them. It's about what best suits you. So coming back to it all, doing the full circle, doing the loop, Irregularities with your period, as I'm sure you're aware of by now, by this point in the podcast, don't necessarily mean anything bad. Periods technically count as irregular if the number of days between your periods suddenly starts to change, the amount of blood you lose is significantly more or significantly less than usual, or the duration of your period varies. Like, that's literally all that's required for it to be considered irregular. So it really, really is a personal thing as to whether or not you feel like there's actually a problem. All of these situations that I've kind of talked about today are pretty much going to happen to everyone who has, or to everyone who had a period, for a variety of reasons which we've just discussed. You know your body, you know when something feels wrong, so please don't ignore that intuition just because socially it seems as normal or that one doctor dismisses your pain. You can find help, you can get medical assistance, it's absolutely there and you deserve to fight for it. Periods can be a mess. They can make you cry, ashamed, fearful, all the negative feelings. But so much of that comes from unnecessary social fear of menstruation. So much of a person's nerves around whether or not they've leaked through their trousers or whether or not they can cope with the cramping during a meeting is because they're worried that the people around them will disapprove. Enough really is enough. We should all understand periods, how they work, and how, in reality, it's easy to be accommodating and supportive when someone is literally actively bleeding for several days, continuously. Whether you've had a period in your life, still do, or are supporting and caring for those around you who'd menstruate, remember that for our entire lives, we've been told that what happens to us every month is gross, unsanitary, and should never be discussed, ever. So if we get mad when you've insinuated we're on our period, or that you see that someone has leaked, or somebody's just asked you for a tampon, be the better person and help a friend out. It's really not that hard. We all deserve to feel safe and supported around our periods. You deserve peace of mind when it comes to your cycle, and it starts with knowledge. Some of which you will have already known when I've spoken today, and there will have definitely been parts you didn't know. Hell, I learned quite a bit from just researching this podcast, so I hope you feel enlightened. This brings us to the end of the episode. I hope you've enjoyed listening to A Galene Woman Is. I am certainly loving our little community. It's so wonderful, so great. If you listened to me at the beginning of this podcast, then hopefully you've taken a little moment to breathe and relax just for you. But if not, totally okay. Just make sure you make a moment later on. You really deserve to. If you found comfort and connection in our discussion today, tap the subscribe button and share the podcast with all those who want to know what's up with their period. There's actually tons of articles on Galene Company around periods and period management. So if you need any other help or have any other questions, definitely check them out. Or leave a question in the Q&A box and I will put together a little explanation for anything asked on our Instagram. So check it out over there if you want it. And if you don't already follow us, it's at Galene Company _. Same for our Facebook, and we're at A Galene Woman Is on TikTok. So follow us to keep self-care in your life. Until next time, take care of yourself. You deserve it.